do I go from there? Major concern, why I seem really nervous is, in spite of what Jamie said, I'm working off of a PowerPoint that I designed, and this is the first time I've dealt with PowerPoint. And I'm definitely afraid that it's not, that it's going to disappear on me. So, those of you who have had me in your class know I'm not a lecturer, so I'd love to be able to do a beautiful, impromptu performance, but I can't. And so I'm going to try to read my lecture in such a way that it is okay for you. But first, I have some thank yous. Of course, everybody has some thank yous, right? First of all, thank you all for coming. And Michael, thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to be part of this series and the panel discussions on violence in the arts. I consider this evening's event actually my, let's say, academic bar mitzvah. My professional coming out, so to speak, since my return to the faculty 3 years ago. I have attended all three of the preceding events in this series and have found the various discussions stimulating and provocative. I want to thank my dear friend and colleague Asher Milbaugh, Director of Exile Studies, for providing a venue for the study of the exile and allowing me to share some of my ideas as they relate to the exilic experience and to share them with his students, because I really depend on my students for my own professional development. And I want to thank my students, many who are here. Would you raise your hands, please? Thank you. They have helped me significantly to work out some of my ideas regarding such interrelated topics as identity, evil, transgression, demonization, alterity, and violence. I also want to apologize to them for some of the repetition they might experience tonight. But no, I will not ask how many of you have trash dicks, right? Okay. I would also like to express to my wife, Paula, my gratitude for her supportive endurance while I put this lecture together. I love you. I have attended all the events in this year's series and have found the discussions and presentations fascinating and provocative. As evidenced in the lectures and panels, violence is clearly a part of our nature as animals and as part of our condition as humans. You remember, if you were at the representations of violence in cinema, Lucas Leiva, the filmmaker who was on the panel, interestingly referenced the YouTube video demonstrating chimpanzees showing violent and nonviolent movies, and that they preferred violent movies. Or at least they got excited and paid attention to the violent movies. So I tried to look it up. There were so many YouTubes on chimpanzees watching violent. Violence can be viewed biologically, anthropologically, sociologically, psychologically, criminologically, legally, historically, ethically, and for the purpose of this program series, artistically. We who are not sociopathic decry violence and the suffering that goes with it as something evil that must be prevented. Yet we also pay billions of dollars to watch representations of violence and suffering in the visual narratives of cinema, the spectacles of theater, the digital involvement with video games, and the grand spectacles of contact sport. Let me ask you this. Which lecture would you go to? Or which course would you rather take? Peace and well-being in the arts, or violence in the arts, violence and suffering in the arts. Why is a lecture series on artistic representations of violence more interesting than a series of on artistic representations of peace and nonviolence? I look forward to your answers at the Q&A. Tonight, I would like to share my thoughts on what I call quiet violence, the deep structure. I borrow the term deep structure from generative linguistics, the structural concept that Noam Chomsky used to identify roots and tactical structures that lead transformationally to individualized surface structures. Metaphorically, I like the concept, and it makes for a sense of time. However, I will not be drawing on structural linguistics, and more likely I will reveal influence by those focused on the ontology of language, who rejected structuralism and the empirical approaches to language, from Ferdinand de Saussure to Jacques Derrida and beyond, all the way to Slavoj Žižek. I think that pronounced. I'm just throwing out the names. I don't intend to talk about them, so don't ask me during Q&A. I do, however, want to call attention to one of my colleagues in the English department, Philip M. Carter, who is bridging the gap between post-structural thought and empirical sociolinguistics. This is no small feat, and his work on language and identity daringly bridges disciplinary gaps that I consider not possible. My lecture on violence in the graphic arts relies heavily on the concept of identity, borrowing from sociological concepts of social formation. That Philip's work will no doubt help evolve my research on evil, transgression, alterity, and violence. Now I'm through with thank yous. Thank you, Rick, for coming. Let me begin with my anecdote about quiet violence. This is a true story, and it happened to me 30 years ago in my first year of teaching at FIU. It was after a class, which I don't remember, that I was speaking with a student who was from one of those countries way south in South America. I don't remember the country specifically, but so let me pick Argentina, since Argentina is way south in South America. I don't recall the context of our conversation. I don't recall much of anything. But I do recall this, because it has stuck with me to this day and is something that I return to in my thoughts on violence and difference. This is a story that I often share with my classes for its pedagogical usefulness. This very pleasant woman, a mother of 2 children, remarked with absolute candor and without a tone of irony or contempt that she was moving out of her neighborhood. The reason for the move was that she did not want her children learning Cuban Spanish. At the time, I was merely struck by the notion that Spanish was apparently just not Spanish. That's just how linguistically and culturally naive I was. This incident stuck with me. I mean, I had certainly been exposed to racial, discriminatory comments of a much more purposefully demeaning fashion, and the stereotyped racially bigoted redneck was a character of much interest in the movies. Just glanced over this place. There was nothing potentially physical about it, but perhaps my exposure to violent nature, physical and verbal discrimination set the paradigm for considering my students' remark as somewhat violent. But how could I call this violent? There was nothing potentially physical about it. She just didn't want her children learning Cuban Spanish. I did not sense a particular hostility towards the Cuban people. She simply did not want her children learning Cuban Spanish. Thinking about this brief moment 30 years later, I tease it apart. Each time I share this story with my students, the woman sometimes comes from Peru or Brazil, but for some reason it is Argentina that evokes the greatest response. I tease it out. Certainly the response that I get from my Cuban American students has ranged from mild, dismissive amusement to indignation. My conclusion has evolved. Everything about this story has to do with identity. The nature of identity is a very broad topic of intellectual discussion from myriad academic disciplines. However we wish to approach the nature of identity, for me, this little story focuses on identity and difference. Difference has an essence, a reality, not simply as a modifier. My Venezuelan student intended to remove her children from her neighborhood, which is an important factor since I read that the strength or integrity of her children's national cultural identity was vulnerable to the violence done by the spoken Spanish of her non-Venezuelan neighbors. Same language, but different, and the difference signifies. So the first lesson I learned from my Peruvian student was, always protect the children from difference. Because they are innocent, they are undifferentiated. They can't protect themselves from the influence of engaging with the other Spanish. From the mother's differentiating perspective, the other Spanish threatens the integrity of the identity she wishes her children to acquire. Thanks to Professor Milbauer, I can recognize this phenomenon to be part of the experience of an exile, or a person displaced from the sources of their identity. So here's my thesis. Don't we all essentially identify who and what we are by differentiating who and what we're not? Often referred to as the capitalized other. In doing so, does not the stability of our identity then require some form of sacrifice and elimination, figuratively or literally, of the other? Ironically, from this perspective, our identity relies on a need for the other, and our need to cast out or sacrifice the other in order to preserve the integrity of we. And when I refer to we, it's a capital We too. We, anthropologist René Girard, in his famous book, Violence and the Sacred, has pointed out how important a sacrificial victim is to the formation of community. So what has this to do with violence? Did my Peruvian student do violence to the Cuban community or its identity? Judging from the stronger responses of my Cuban American students, I read that my student from Lima, if she were identified as being in this class, in the class where I tell the story, might find herself in the position of other. Of course, that is only if I had reported what she said to the class she was attending. She might face verbal rebukes, be given dirty looks, or possibly be told to go back where she came from. Oh no, go back to where she belongs. Go back where she belongs. Implying that she does not belong in the neighborhood from which she wishes to remove her children. Now she is the other, and in an act of differentiation, her expulsion, why doesn't she go back where she belongs, serves to maintain the identity that she previously violated by her act of differentiation. Of course, in retelling the story to my classes here in Miami, I'm really the devil who caused her violence by telling the story to those whose identity she violated. Does the tree falling in the forest make a sound? Is an education, at least in the humanities, a form of violence? Actually, how much of a student's education is an assault on some aspect of their identity? Can this be called quiet violence? But this is a lecture on the graphic arts, because the theater arts and the cinematic arts are predominantly mimetic in their interest in representing human action and experience. They clearly can represent the physical and verbal violence done by human beings to other human beings. And they do it primarily through the sequence of events through a story. The logic of the violence being embedded in some form of logic relying on assumed shared values between the audience and the story in the spectacle. Most of the presentations and discussion in this lecture series focused on the psychological and emotional effect representations of violence might have on its audience. The concern was whether mimetic violence promotes actual violence, and here I refer to physical violence, such as the actual massacre of the film audience by someone who obsessed with a specific violent movie. The assumption is that life imitates art, that the representations of violence in the theater and the movies promote or reinforce an identification and a wish to recreate violent behavior. There is, however, a quiet violence done to audiences that is purposeful and intended by the artist, dramatist, or filmmaker to destabilize the assumed shared values and beliefs of the audience, of its audience. In other words, these works of art confront the audience with difference in a way that challenges identity. This is clearly the intention of the modernist theater and film of the surrealists, such as Antonin Artaud with his concept of the theater of cruelty, a modernist concept of confronting a theater audience with illogical and aleatory actions, and that are intended to shake a bourgeois audience's assumed complacent beliefs and values, to activate them for a purpose, or anarchistically for no purpose. How better to illustrate this than by showing you Louis Buñuel's famous, infamous sequence in his surrealist film, Un Chien Andalou. This is as direct an assault on its audience that a film can provide. Is this not quiet violence? Is this not quiet violence? To me, this is more violent than the simple narrative representations of one character mutilating another. In the visual medium of film, the literal representation of slicing an eyeball metaphorically draws on the focal point of the audience's somatic contact with the film. This short sequence, which has minimal story references, also qualifies as a simple visual image that is set up specifically to do violence by what Julia Kristeva would call the abject, thereby revealing the power of horror, which is the title of the book. As related to Un Chien Andalou, the power of the abject is used for the aesthetic, political purposes of the surrealist movement to disrupt the identity of the bourgeois class. Well, this is a class, this is a lecture, sorry. This is a lecture on violence in the graphic arts. So at least for this lecture, I consider the graphic arts to mechanically or digitally reproduce single composites of text and imagery for a purpose. These composites may reference a story, but more likely reference a concept, such as the concept of virility, which is artistically aligned with the commodity item of a cigarette product, say in a Marlboro ad. Do they still have cigarettes? The purpose is obvious in Marlboro, right? I suppose what I'm about to present falls under the category of violence in the graphic arts, specifically the war propaganda imagery from the collections of the Wolfsonian Museum here at Florida International University. 3 years ago, I was fortunate to receive a Mellon-supported grant from the Wolfsonian, supporting research which led to my incorporating the use of the propaganda collection by my graduate students in a seminar on representations of evil in the 20th and 21st centuries. As I became familiar with the very rich collections, I began to focus on their collection of war propaganda, specifically World Wars I and II. since my interest in the pragmatics of evil had to do with a very specific act of differentiation called demonization, I found the rhetorical design of the propaganda posters and artifacts to rely on the assumptions of identity and difference in a very conscious and overtly purposeful manner. Clearly, as you will see, unlike the quiet violence of differentiation articulated in my anecdotal introduction, identity and difference are aligned with the larger power struggles belonging to war among nations. War propaganda has a very interesting and blatant rhetorical strategy. In terms of identity, it assumes a zero-sum game. Like all contact sport, war assumes that there will ultimately be one prevailing identity. After all, when you go to a football game, you sit on one side or the other. You root for the team with which you identify. So propaganda assumes certain shared identities. It relies on these assumed identities in order to orient its intended audience. We against the other. The constructed threat to the assumed identity. I would now like to go through selected images and artifacts from the Wolfsonian collection, but first I wish to express my gratitude to the Wolfsonian for granting me and my students the opportunity intellectually and pedagogically to engage in such rich archival experience. I especially want to thank John Mogul, who's got a title I'm not sure of, but he was fellowship coordinator at the time and research associate. Frank Luca, who's here, who's the chief librarian at the Wolfsonian, and Nikki Harson, Rare Book Catalog. I want to thank them for their professional expertise and collegial support. I love working with these people. I encourage those of you who can to work with them in the archives. Are there any graduate students from that class here? Okay. I would also like to call attention to another beneficiary of the Wolfsonian's program, my colleague in religious studies, Professor Orrin Steer, who currently has an exhibit at the Frost Museum of material from the Wolfsonian collection related to what I consider the visual construction of racial identity under Nazi National Socialism. I find it interesting to note that Professor Steer chose propaganda imagery that served directly to construct a positivist, idealistic Aryan identity, as opposed to the imagery that I have chosen, of course. The imagery that I have chosen, that I lost my place in, that I have chosen, which constructs racial identity through violent differentiation. My sense of race as an identity construct is influenced by two social theorists of race, Michael Omi and Howard Nimitz, in their seminal book, Racial Formation in the United States. The whole issue of Aryanism and Judaism as racial identities, leading to what has been identified as genocide, the Holocaust, is a very provocative topic, to which I will defer to my colleague who specializes in genocide, Professor Richard Olson, Director of Extreme Events. I now present my examples of propaganda material by thematic categories related to the rhetorical construction and representation of what identity was being threatened and who was being represented as the threatening other, and how they were represented as the threatening other. I would propose that war propaganda's rhetorical necessity is to dehumanize the enemy, to thoroughly dissociate identity with the enemy, so that it is logically possible to ethically and morally support those who are authorized by the state to physically eliminate the enemy. First category, dangerous bullies. Bolshevism against the family. You see this? You're going to have to excuse some of my translation that it's Googleized, so don't make any claims. This is an Italian fascist poster representing a very ethnic Russian communist soldier. The representation of a dark, aggressive, inhuman foreigner in the act of tug-of-war with the white mother over her child is supported by the appropriation of Lenin's quote, "The family is the biggest disgrace created in civilized countries." The victims are represented as innocent and vulnerable, for what could be more natural than the relationship between the mother and her child? I put quotation marks around natural, because it's going to be an important issue. Clearly, the signification of innocence and vulnerability, something natural, untouched by political ideology, makes communism the unnatural, dangerous bully. Brothers, save me. Another plea from an innocent mother and child with her direct eye contact with the intended audience. As in the previous poster, the intended audience is presumed, I think, is presumed to be male, with a moral claim to protect. Here we have a German poster. The enemy sees your light. Lights out, they're doomed. They're doomed him. An RAF, a Royal Air Force, British, an RAF theme descending upon the helpless victim. Can you see it down there at the bottom? The helpless victim, whose shadow casts a sign of the cross. Pax Britannica, British peace. The threat of British power signified by the bully country's colonizing history is referenced by the tentacles of the inhuman human octopus. Italy again, they have all these tentacles. Fascist Italians are interesting. A smile is enough. To speak my virtue, a smile is enough. How do you demonize a bully nation whose president is constantly smiling, which is a part of the branding of Franklin D. Roosevelt's public image? Juxtapose it with the logic of American destruction, and he becomes a bully hypocrite. Here we have a Jewish communist American bully. Another poster from Mussolini's fascist Republic of Salo. An interesting representation of the bully other as a caricaturized Jew with the communist red star, perhaps here associated with the Star of David, literally backed by the American icon, the Statue of Liberty. Caricature the mimetic exaggeration of physical features plays a crucial role in making it difficult for the intended audience to identify or otherwise humanize the object of demonization. Isn't it apparent how necessary the other is to the confirmation of the identity of the community or nation as, to use a sociological term, a social formation, or I would characterize as an identity formation. From the concept of formation, we, whoever we are, confirm ourselves by who we are not. The other, ironically, has an identity, but it is represented in differential value terms. Rhetorically speaking, in the category of the dangerous bullies, the other, logically, represents a national or ideological antagonist, signifying a belligerent threat to the identity of the intended audience. In the case of this poster, there are no words. The fist is directed at the implied Italian we. The poster operates on the level of national, socioeconomic, and religious identity. Next category is the dangerous conspirators, those others who threaten the dangerous bullies. I call this one the Fiddler on the Roof. The following poster series, it was a series of posters I'm going to show you, advertises an anti-Masonic exhibit. These are from Serbia. Here the other is the Jew, whose threat is that of secret conspiracy with communism, Freemasonry, with financial support in order to achieve control over the world, whereas the previous category depicted the other as an overtly aggressive threat. These dangerous conspirators operate with stealth, perhaps because these others, historically speaking, were in actuality marginal to the national power structures, and therefore could not be assigned the brand of bully. The previous Italian poster, that is of the aggressive Jewish communist, what's the other name? Anyway, the preceding poster is uncharacteristic in doing so and might reveal a less subtle focus on differentiation, a cruder form of anti-Semitism than what the Serbian posters reveal. Jews hold the puppets in their hand. All of these are ads for an anti-Masonic exhibit. The secret alliance among Jewry, communism, and the secret society of Freemasonry. This poster depicts a mystical relationship by showing all of the signs and symbols of social, political, and religious identity to which the audience is presumed to be denied access by these dangerous conspirators. Who will tip the balance? The Jews hold the difference. The difference is a significant term in this lecture. Right? The Jew demonstrates control over two hegemonic economic systems, both capitalism and communism. Two hegemonic economic systems antithetical to fascism's exclusive national identities. The caricatured Orthodox Jew balances the resources of capitalism with Stalin's communism. Here, the dangerous other ironically holds balance between two antagonistic economic systems. The Jewish dream of ruling the world is stopped by the blows of awakening nationalism. Here, we have another Orthodox Jew necromantically spinning the world dreidel, exercising a power which must be eliminated through the awakening nationalism of fascism, with its exclusionary concept of national identity by demonizing economic systems rather than national identity of the enemy. Have enough? Well, there's more to come. In the service of lies, caricature in the visual arts exaggerates physical features. How many of you have sat and paid for sketches and portraits that exaggerate your facial features, enjoying the temporary and benign assault on your personal identity? We are amused at regarding ourselves differentially. In order to reassure ourselves that perhaps there are things about our physical attributes that we don't like, but at least we don't really look like that. Humorously, we demonize ourselves and perhaps conclude that, yes, I have big lips, or ears, or nose, but not as big as that image. However, the visual representations of exaggerated physical characteristics to identify the other serve social, national, cultural, religious, and racial identity formation at the expense of the other identity. Differentiation and demonization deconstruct the identity of the other. To repeat my thesis, we identify who we are by who we are not. We need the other, and in doing so, we do violence to the integrity of the other's identity. Of course, war propaganda graphic art that employs caricature to national, social, ethnic, and racial characteristics serves to differentiate in such a way as to distance its intended audience, capitalized we, from identifying with the enemy. The less we can identify with the other, the easier it is to accept the moral logic of demonization, leading to exclusion, banishment, or physical elimination in the name of social, national, religious, ethnic, or racial good. Teach your children well. The way I read the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve were, I want to say, the Satan or the serpent's first graduating students. Okay? By eating the forbidden tree of knowledge, from the forbidden tree of knowledge, they could differentiate between good and evil. So education has something to do with forbidden knowledge that's derived from differentiation. They acquired moral enemy, acquired moral conscience, and that was shame. Their shame came from recognizing their nakedness, which I assume had to do with gender differentiation, since they immediately sewed fig leaves together and covered the signs of gender difference, sort of Lacanian, Freudian Lacanian Oedipal crisis. So we inherit the original sin and continue in the tradition of educating our innocent children by developing their conscience through differentiation. What is good and evil, right and wrong, just and unjust, and what brings shame? Shame being the awareness of transgressing the boundaries of the source of our identity. So, the identity formation underlying our World War II propaganda in the form of conscience development extends to the education of the children. Their gift is the poisonous mushroom is probably the most infamous in a series of anti-Semitic children's storybooks published by Julian Stryker, a rabid and anti-Semite. Alexander Hardy, the United States prosecutor at the Nuremberg war crime trials, asserts that Stryker, quote, more than any other person, was responsible for the Jews' extermination. In his history of the Nazi propaganda, Hitler's secret weapon, the managed press and propaganda machine of Nazi Germany, Hardy points out that as early as 1925, Stryker, an early leader of the Socialist Party and early rival of Hitler, identified mass extermination as the final solution. Stryker was the publisher of an anti-Semitic newspaper, Der Stürmer, which, according to Hardy, quote, had no equal in the history of mankind for dissemination of hatred. Stryker was tried at Nuremberg and executed for war crimes. Each of the 17 stories in the poisonous mushroom educates children not about Jewish identity, but about how to identify. That is, differentiate a Jew from an Aryan. Obviously, the Jewish identity opposes Aryan identity. Children are taught to differentiate the good from the bad identity, learning how important it is to differentiate edible from poisonous mushrooms. How to identify a Jew. The first of 17 stories in the poisonous mushroom focuses on how one can identify a Jew by his nose. Franz, the best scholar in the class, advances to the blackboard and provides a mnemonic analogy to the inverted number 6. Each story ends with a cautionary demonizing poem. This one literally identifying the Jew as the devil other. Youth are admonished to join us to get rid of the Jewish devil. These were read in classes. These were class books. So, teach your children well. These are children reading their gift grades. Okay? I like the Crosby, Stills National Money lyric, and it makes even more sense. Teach your children well. Their father's help did slowly go by. Unfortunately, education works. Now I to go to racial formation and what I call the degrees of separation. I'm assuming that the propaganda imagery that you have seen so far likely bothers you. Likely bothers you because our national historical identity lies with the victors and the victims of World War II. There is perhaps a degree of separation from we, the audience of history, and the intended historical audience of the posters, who are now for us, probably, the other. These posters do not represent us. When I first worked with these posters, I would literally go home and take a shower. This is not us. And us, it's a capital us. Even among enemies of war, there is differentiation. America was at war on two fronts, Europe and Asia, and it is interesting to see the qualitative difference between the American propaganda regarding the war against Japan and the war against fascist Germany and Italy. Mostly Germany. I didn't find a lot of American propaganda against fascist Italy. Didn't go that far. John Dower, in his sobering history of the American war against Japan, War Without Mercy, has convincingly pointed out how much more vicious and dehumanizing was the American war attitude toward Japan and the Japanese as the enemies, and that it was racial identity underlying the more brutal approach to defeating Japan. In countless ways, war words and race words came to, I'm quoting, I'm sorry, this is Dow, all right? In countless ways, war words and race words came together in a manner which did not just reflect the savagery of the war, but contributed to it by reinforcing the impression of a truly Manichaean struggle between completely incompatible antagonists. The natural response to such a vision was an obsession with extermination on both sides, what he calls a war without mercy. So far, we have been looking at social, cultural, national identity, and it is easier to accept the suggestion that these social formations are born out of a set of agreed upon values by which we identify as the social we. The stronger the agreement, the more the identity becomes essentialized and assumed to be natural. When difference intrudes, as it always will, for our identity to remain essential, the essential we must contain or eliminate the challenge to this assumption about our identity. When it comes to racial identity or even gender identity, the essentialist claim becomes even stronger. Are not race and gender natural distinctions? Skin color or shared physical characteristics? Aren't they borne out genetically? Shared physical adaptations to a shared environment? Propaganda drawing on racial identity makes a qualitatively greater claim to the threat of the other as being not simply national, social, or ideological, but natural. The Japs are our natural enemies, a qualitatively different enemy from our Western European enemies, who out of their own needs for an essential identity were very successful in demonizing and dehumanizing their own Jewish nationals, leading to an authorized, systematic, and systemic program of what has been called genocide. In calling the atrocity a genocide, the claim is that the atrocities were committed in the name of racial identity, or more specifically, a national identity becomes a natural identity, hence the Aryan race. Racial identity can be theorized as a formation, which Michael Omi and Howard Winant did in their seminal book, Racial Formation in the United States. Racial identity formation can be viewed from two levels according to their theory. The local, which they call the discursive micro level, or racial identity formation, to the transformations and appropriations of discursive racial identity at the macro levels of the social political, through which they identify as racial projects that on one level addresses identity, but at the next serves the appropriation of power and hegemony. Although they dismiss post-structural theory in one sentence, in calling attention to discursive practices, that's their word, at the micro level, they are essentially referencing the primacy of language in identity formation, a sine qua non in the post-structural concept of subjectivity and the relationship between difference and meaning. I believe that the discourse of race used in the war propaganda could certainly be seen as a racial project from the perspective of Omi and Winant's formation theory. Keep the Jap terror from your home, Is this caricature? This is not an illustration, a drawing. This is a staged photograph. The menacing other was probably a Japanese-American model, serving his country in the war effort. Rhetorically speaking, this threat to innocence through the referential imagery of the infant toys engages the audience's imagination to a greater degree than the image of the Bolshevik ripping the child away from his mother's arms in the Italian poster. This is the enemy. Here, the intended audience must have been the American male, suggesting that the Yellow Peril's threat to the white male's identity through the loss of sexual possession of the white naked female. It is a call for conscience. Here, this racial other represents a threat to the body politic. The Yanks are coming. Watch the little yellow man yellow. All I can think of is the sadistic dentist in Little Shop of Horrors. This is a clinically dangerous book. Here we come. Kill the Jap. Here's an artifact. Killing the other now is a game for our amusement. The degree of separation is now so complete that the nuclear elimination of roughly 200,000 citizens of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was accepted as a logical necessity for ending the war. We, historically, did celebrate these two historical events in good conscience. Here it is. And what kind of demonizing applies to our European enemies? A Mussolini matchbook. See the matches. A Hitler matchbook. My favorite, the Hotsy Nazi pincushion. Now okay, they are a set. There's a point, and there is one. And I could go to, the characterizations and the quality of those, but I'll leave it at that. I just want to be honest. They're a set. You were set up. Right? But now we return to the Republic of Sela. Now, what about those Italians? Can you read this? Not the Italian. This is my liberal translation. The liberating Americans promised dollars and work to the Italians. But if 12 million of their unemployed laborers live on subsidies, what will be given in return to a defeated population, if not slavery and shame? I call this poster the Uncle Sam Tom. The Uncle Sam Tom. Is the racial project the same as in the American propaganda against the Japs? Is the implied threat here racial? Or is it a metaphoric counter to the claims of the United States as liberators of the Italians from fascism? The rhetorical implication being that liberation is being promised by a nation with a history of racial enslavement. As it would be, here the suggested hypocrisy of America as liberator and slaveholder is not overt, and a more literal racist meaning could be read. And finally, we have another dangerous bully. Protect them from the black market. Now we have a racial project for a good cause. Protect them from the black market, a Dutch poster demonizing black market activity through racial, bestial bully imagery. This must have been aimed at the black market for medicine, with the black beast holding the caduceus of Mercury. I'm assuming that the object of demonization here is an illegal economic practice, in turn. But the literal image of the demon relies on an implicit understanding regarding racial identity. The next category just introduces one poster, which I how do you say it now, like? Don't let the shadow touch them. Can you see the shadow? Here, the innocent children being threatened by the shadow of the enemy are already engaged in the educational process. As the older boy holds the model of an American bomber, perhaps the B-29 Enola Gay, headed for Hiroshima, or the B-29 Boxcar, headed for Nagasaki. With his other hand, he protectively stays the younger boy who holds the flag of their national identity. The little girl has possession of none of the signifiers of power and hegemony. Her identity education is in another direction. What the bullies leave behind. Now we return to the rhetoric of the abject that we experienced in Anshan Andalou. Here we are visually assaulted by images of dead and mutilated bodies, images that manifest the rhetorical power of horror. Liberators, the beasts in the air have torn 256 children from their Milanese mothers. Fence-sitters, Anglophiles, feel proud of the heroic feats of your accomplices. These are victims of the Allied Strategic Bombing Directive, a campaign of aerial bombing by the British Royal Air Force, of which Milan was one of a number of bombing targets. This is 1942 through 1943. Do you want to load up the close-ups for you? Just want to make sure you're still okay.
Is that a photograph?
That's a photograph. Yeah, it's hard to see. But these are 4 children, corpses of children. All right. Images of the abject signify a violation of the body, the ultimate dissolution of identity. For if we are looking for an essential identity, surely it comes from our identification with our bodies. I won't refer to our bodies ourselves. The book. This rhetorical use of the abject is fused with the representation of innocent victims. They are not only innocent because they were non-combatants, like the victims of the Holocaust or Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also because of their natural immaturity. They are presumed not to be complicit in the social formation and the necessary violence that comes with it. That comes with age. Bombardment, a Dutch 1936 poster, calling to conscience the bombing, I'm assuming it's from Germany, the bombing in Madrid during the Spanish Civil War. Silent. Silent is the world's conscience. I mean, basically, where are your feelings? Where are you? Can you look at this and not